pregnant woman gave birth to 20 babies in one day. How did this happen? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. Maria sat on the wooden steps of her modest farmhouse, staring out at the vast expanse of golden fields that stretched far beyond the horizon. The early morning sun warmed her skin, but inside, a chill had settled into her bones. She couldn't shake the feeling that something in her life had changed, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. The faint cries of chickens echoed from the coop nearby, and the rhythmic clinking of metal from her husband, Juan, working in the shed filled the quiet air. Life in their small village had always been predictable. The days were long but peaceful, marked by routines that never wavered. Maria had married young at just 21, and in the 12 years since, she and Juan had built a life together, simple, honest, and filled with hard work. But lately, something had felt different. Maria absent-mindedly placed a hand on her abdomen, her fingers brushing against the soft fabric of her dress. It was her third pregnancy, and at first, it had felt no different from the first two. A slight sickness in the mornings, the tender swell of her belly as weeks turned into months. But this time, the weight of it all, quite literally, felt unbearable. Her first two pregnancies had been smooth and uneventful, leading to the births of her two beautiful daughters, Lucia and Sofia. Now 7 and 5 years old, they played joyfully near the farmhouse, their laughter ringing out like bells. Maria loved being a mother, and she loved the life she and Juan had created, even if it was humble. But the heaviness in her body, the strange flutters and movements that seemed to multiply day after day, made her uneasy. "Are you feeling all right?" Juan's voice broke through her thoughts. She looked up to see him standing in the doorway, wiping his grease-streaked hands on a cloth. His brow furrowed with concern as he studied her. Maria managed a smile, though it felt weak. "I'm fine," she replied softly. Juan didn't look convinced. He stepped closer, crouching down to rest a hand on her knee. "You've been tired, Maria. More than usual. You're working yourself too hard." Maria shook her head, though she felt the truth of his words settle deep inside her. "It's not that," she admitted, glancing down at her hands. "It's this baby. Something feels different." Juan's expression softened, and he took her hand in his own. "Every baby is different, Carino. You said the same thing with Sofia, remember? And she turned out perfect?" Maria wanted to believe him. She wanted to brush off the unease as nothing more than her imagination. But as she looked into her husband's kind, brown eyes, she felt the weight of her secret pressing down on her. "I've been feeling," she hesitated, searching for the words. "More movement. Too much movement. It doesn't feel normal." Juan frowned, his thumb rubbing circles over her knuckles. "Have you told the doctor?" Maria sighed, shaking her head. "Oh, I didn't want to sound foolish. It's probably nothing." "It's not foolish if you're worried," Juan replied firmly. "We'll go see the doctor this afternoon. Just to be sure." Maria nodded reluctantly, though the thought of visiting the doctor filled her with dread. Deep down, she knew Juan was right. Something about this pregnancy was unlike anything she had experienced before. The small clinic in their village was run by Dr. Alvarez, a man who had delivered most of the babies in the area, including Maria's two daughters. His office was tucked inside a whitewashed building, its walls lined with posters about nutrition and vaccines. Maria sat nervously on the examination table, her hands resting on her lap as Dr. Alvarez prepared to examine her. Juan stood nearby, his arms crossed, offering silent reassurance. "So, Maria," Dr. Alvarez began, adjusting his glasses. "You said you've been feeling unusual movement?" "Yes," Maria replied quietly. "More than I remember with my other pregnancies." "And strong." Dr. Alvarez nodded, his expression calm but professional. "Every pregnancy is different, as you know. But let's take a look, just to be certain." Maria lay back as Dr. Alvarez prepared the ultrasound machine, the low hum of its machinery filling the small room. The gel he spread on her stomach was cold, sending a shiver up her spine, but she tried to focus on her breathing. Juan moved closer, resting a hand on her shoulder. "It'll be all right," he murmured. Dr. Alvarez moved the ultrasound probe over Maria's stomach, his eyes fixed on the screen. At first, the room was quiet, save for the soft, crackling sound of the machine. Then, his brow furrowed slightly, and he leaned closer to the monitor, adjusting the angle of the probe. "What is it?" Maria asked, her voice tight with anxiety. Dr. Alvarez didn't respond right away. He stared at the screen, his expression unreadable, before finally speaking. "Maria, I need to double-check something. Give me just a moment." The doctor stood quickly and moved to a cabinet, pulling out a small folder and flipping through its pages. Juan and Maria exchanged a nervous glance, the tension in the room palpable. "What's wrong, doctor?" Juan asked, his voice sharp with concern. Dr. Alvarez turned back to them, his expression carefully neutral. "There's nothing to panic about just yet," he said calmly. "But, Maria, I'm detecting multiple heartbeats." Maria froze, her mind unable to process his words. "Multiple?" she echoed weakly. "How many?" Juan pressed, his voice shaking. Dr. Alvarez took a deep breath, pointing to the screen. "It's hard to tell at this stage, but there are definitely more than 2. Possibly more than 3. Maria's heart began to race, her hands clutching the edge of the table. "What does that mean?" "It means you're likely carrying multiples," Dr. Alvarez explained gently. "Twins are common, sometimes even triplets. But what I'm seeing here is unusual." One stepped forward, his face pale. "How unusual?" Dr. Alvarez hesitated before replying. "I've never seen this many heartbeats in a single pregnancy before." Maria's breathing grew shallow, and she felt as though the room were spinning around her. Multiple heartbeats? How was that even possible? She looked at the doctor, searching his face for some kind of reassurance, but all she saw was the same uncertainty she felt in her own heart. "We'll need to conduct more tests," Dr. Alvarez said, his tone steady but urgent. "I'll refer you to the hospital in the city. They'll have better equipment to determine exactly what's going on." Maria nodded faintly, unable to form words. Her hands trembled as one helped her sit up, his own face a mask of disbelief. "Is it dangerous?" One asked quietly. Dr. Alvarez's expression softened. "It's a high-risk pregnancy, no question. Carrying multiples can put a lot of strain on the body, especially when there are this many. But we'll take it one step at a time. The specialists in the city will know more." Maria sat in stunned silence, her mind racing. She had come to the clinic expecting answers, but instead, she had more questions than ever. How many babies was she carrying? What would this mean for her health? For her family? "Thank you, doctor," one said, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. Dr. Alvarez nodded, placing a reassuring hand on Maria's shoulder. "We'll figure this out, Maria. You're not alone." But as they left the clinic and stepped back into the sunlight, Maria couldn't shake the overwhelming sense of dread that clung to her. The news spread through the village like wildfire. By the next morning, neighbors and friends were stopping by the farmhouse, their faces filled with curiosity and awe. People whispered about Maria's pregnancy, calling it a miracle, a mystery, and, for some, a curse. "I heard she's having 5 babies," one woman muttered to another at the market. No, another replied, shaking her head. "I heard it's 8. 8 babies? That's not natural." Maria stayed inside the house, avoiding the gossip and the stares. She couldn't bear the thought of facing anyone. Her body felt heavy and alien, as though it no longer belonged to her. Every flutter, every shift, felt like a reminder that something extraordinary, something terrifying, was happening inside her. One did his best to reassure her, but even he struggled to hide his fear. "We'll get through this," he told her one night as they sat together on the edge of the bed. "No matter what happens, we'll figure it out." But as Maria lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, she wondered if that was true. How could anyone be prepared for something like this? The following week, Maria and Juan traveled to the city hospital for further tests. The journey felt long and exhausting. Maria shifted uncomfortably in the passenger seat of their old pickup truck, her swollen belly making every bump in the road feel like a jolt to her spine. Juan drove in silence, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. Neither of them spoke much, but the weight of their fears sat heavy between them. The city was unlike their quiet village, loud, crowded, and overwhelming. The hospital itself was a maze of polished floors, fluorescent lights, and sterile smells. Maria clung to Juan's arm as they navigated the labyrinth of hallways leading to the maternal fetal medicine unit. When they finally reached the waiting room, Maria sank into a chair with a groan, her back aching. Around her, other pregnant women sat with their partners, but none of them seemed to carry the same quiet anxiety she felt. They were laughing, smiling, sharing hopeful glances. Maria looked away, her hands instinctively resting on her massive belly. They don't know what this feels like, she thought. They don't know what it's like to carry the weight of a miracle or a curse. One squeezed her shoulder gently. "It'll be okay," he murmured. Before Maria could reply, a nurse appeared in the doorway. "Maria Lopez?" Maria stood slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. One helped her to her feet, and together they followed the nurse down a long hallway to an examination room. The doctor who greeted them introduced himself as Dr. Patel, a kind-looking man with graying hair and warm brown eyes. "Mrs. Lopez," he said, smiling kindly. "It's a pleasure to meet you. Dr. Alvarez sent over your file, and we'll be conducting a full assessment today to understand what's going on with your pregnancy." Maria nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She lay back on the examination table as the nurse prepared her for another ultrasound, the familiar cold gel spreading across her abdomen. One stayed by her side, holding her hand as the machine whirred to life. Dr. Patel's expression shifted almost immediately as he studied the screen. His smile faded into something more serious, his brow furrowing as he adjusted the probe. Maria watched him anxiously, trying to decipher the meaning behind his silence. "What is it, doctor?" One asked, his voice tight with worry. Dr. Patel didn't answer right away. He pressed a button on the machine, marking several spots on the monitor, before finally speaking. "Mrs. Lopez," he began carefully, "you are carrying an extraordinary number of babies." Maria's heart stopped. "How many?" she whispered. Dr. Patel turned the screen toward them, pointing to the swirling images of tiny forms on the monitor. "Based on what we're seeing here, I count at least 18 heartbeats. Possibly more." 18. The word rang in Maria's ears like a bell. She squeezed Juan's hand so tightly her knuckles turned white. 18? Juan echoed, his voice cracking. "That can't be possible." Dr. Patel nodded solemnly. "It's extremely rare, but not impossible. Your body has undergone a phenomenon called superfetation, where multiple fertilized eggs implant and develop simultaneously. Cases like this are almost unheard of, but it's happening here." Maria felt lightheaded, as though the room were tilting beneath her. "What does this mean for the babies?" she managed to ask. Dr. Patel's expression softened. "It's a high-risk pregnancy, no question. Carrying this many babies puts immense strain on your body. We'll need to monitor you very closely. You'll likely deliver early, much earlier than most pregnancies, and there's a chance some of the babies will be very small or require immediate medical care." Maria swallowed hard, tears stinging her eyes. "Will they survive?" Dr. Patel hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "We're going to do everything we can to ensure they do. You've already made it further along than many women with multiple pregnancies. That's a good sign." One cleared his throat, his voice shaking. "And Maria? What about her?" Dr. Patel turned his gaze to Juan. "Her health is our top priority as well. The next few weeks will be critical. I'm recommending she stay in the hospital under constant observation. It's the safest option, for both her and the babies." Maria closed her eyes as Juan's hand trembled in hers. Staying in the hospital would mean leaving her daughters, leaving the home she had worked so hard to keep. But she knew the doctor was right. "I'll do whatever I have to," she whispered, her voice breaking. Dr. Patel smiled gently. "You're strong, Maria. We'll take this one step at a time." The news spread like wildfire. By the time Maria was admitted to the hospital, reporters had already caught wind of her story. "Woman pregnant with 18 babies" was plastered across headlines, accompanied by sensationalized photos and interviews with neighbors who claimed to know her. Strangers on social media debated whether it was a miracle or an exaggeration. Some called it a blessing, others labeled it unnatural. Maria, however, knew none of this. Confined to her hospital room, she focused on getting through each day. Nurses came and went, checking her vital signs, running tests, and monitoring the baby's heartbeats. The once familiar rhythm of her life, early mornings on the farm, playing with Lucia and Sophia, quiet evenings with Juan, felt like a distant memory. Juan visited every day, bringing stories from home and drawings from the girls. "They miss you," he told her, his voice soft as he held her hand. "Lucia says you're going to be famous." Maria managed a weak smile. "I don't care about fame. I just want to go home." "You will," Juan promised. "As soon as the babies are safe." Maria's days blurred together in a haze of tests, medications, and exhaustion. She could feel the babies moving constantly now, a relentless shifting that sometimes made her gasp in discomfort. The doctors marveled at her resilience, calling her a miracle mother and reminding her how rare her situation truly was. But Maria didn't feel like a miracle. She felt like a woman holding on by a thread, praying that her body could endure the impossible. One evening, as the sun set outside her hospital window, Maria's nurse, Elena, sat beside her bed, gently fluffing her pillows. Elena was young, with kind eyes and a soothing presence that reminded Maria of her own daughters. "Mrs. Lopez," Elena said softly, "you're stronger than you think." Maria looked at her, tears welling in her eyes. "Everyone keeps saying that. But I don't feel strong. I'm scared, Elena. Scared I won't make it. Scared I'll fail them." Elena took Maria's hand in hers. "Being scared doesn't mean you're weak. It means you care. It means you're fighting." Maria blinked back tears. "What if I can't do it?" "You can," Elena replied firmly. "And you're not alone. We're all here to help you, every doctor, every nurse. You're carrying something extraordinary, and we won't let you face it alone." Maria nodded, her chest tightening with emotion. For so long, she had carried the weight of this pregnancy in silence, afraid to share the full extent of her fears. But now, surrounded by a team of people who believed in her, she felt a flicker of hope. As the weeks passed, Maria's condition grew more difficult. Her body ached constantly, and even the simplest movements left her breathless. The doctors began discussing plans for an early delivery, carefully coordinating a team of specialists who would be ready to care for the babies the moment they were born. "It's going to be a long and complex delivery," Dr. Patel explained during one of Juan's visits. "We'll need surgeons, neonatal specialists, and nurses, all working together." Juan nodded, his face pale but determined. "We trust you, doctor." Maria listened quietly, her hand resting on her belly as the babies shifted beneath her touch. She could feel them, 20 tiny lives growing inside her, waiting to take their first breaths. The thought filled her with equal parts fear and wonder. She looked up at Juan, tears pooling in her eyes. "Promise me we'll get through this?" Juan knelt beside her bed, taking her hand in both of his. "I promise, Maria. We're going to meet our babies, and you're going to hold each and every one of them." Maria closed her eyes, his words wrapping around her like a shield. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to believe it. They would get through this. Together. The morning of Maria's delivery arrived with an air of quiet tension that rippled through the entire hospital. The team of doctors, nurses, and specialists had spent weeks preparing, yet there was still a sense of awe and nervous energy among them. Delivering 20 babies in one day was unprecedented, something that most of them had only read about in medical journals, never expecting to witness firsthand. Maria lay in her hospital bed, propped up on pillows, trying to steady her breathing as the reality of what was about to happen sank in. The sunlight filtering through the window cast a warm glow across the room, but Maria couldn't find any comfort in it. Her body felt impossibly heavy, every inch of her aching from the weight of the babies growing inside her. Juan sat beside her, holding her hand and offering soft words of encouragement. He looked calm for her sake, but Maria could see the worry lurking behind his dark eyes. He hadn't slept much in the past week, pacing the hospital hallways late into the night, but he refused to leave her side. "How are you feeling?" Juan asked softly, brushing a strand of hair from her damp forehead. Maria forced a small smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Like I'm about to climb a mountain without my legs." Juan chuckled weakly, though his voice cracked with emotion. "You're strong, Maria. Stronger than anyone I know. You'll get through this? She squeezed his hand tightly. Promise me you'll take care of them, no matter what happens? His smile faltered. Don't say that. Promise me, she repeated, her voice trembling. One swallowed hard but nodded. I promise. Before either of them could say more, Dr. Patel entered the room, flanked by 2 nurses. His expression was calm and steady, a reassuring presence amidst the storm brewing outside the door. Maria, he said gently, it's time? The words hit her like a wave, but she nodded resolutely. There was no turning back now. The delivery room was a flurry of activity. Specialists in scrubs moved quickly, setting up incubators, warming tables, and surgical instruments. A team of neonatal nurses stood ready, prepared to care for the babies the moment they arrived. The room buzzed with urgency, every detail meticulously planned. Maria was wheeled in on a gurney, her face pale but determined. One walked alongside her, holding her hand until the very last moment. When they reached the sterile operating area, a nurse gently stopped him. I'm sorry, Mr. Lopez, she said softly, but you can't come in here. We need to focus completely on Maria and the babies. Juan froze, his hands still wrapped around Maria's. But it's okay, Maria interrupted, her voice surprisingly steady. She looked up at Juan, her eyes brimming with love. I'll see you soon. Go wait with the girls. Juan bent down, pressing a kiss to her forehead. I love you, he whispered, his voice breaking. I love you too, Maria replied, her voice strong despite the tears rolling down her cheeks. As Juan stepped back, the nurses wheeled Maria into the operating room. The bright lights overhead made everything feel surreal, as though she were floating in a dream. The hum of machines, the low murmur of voices, and the rhythmic beeping of monitors filled the air. Maria, Dr. Patel said, standing beside her, we're ready to begin. You're in good hands. She nodded faintly, focusing on the sound of his voice as the anesthesiologist administered medication to numb her lower body. Maria couldn't see much beyond the blue surgical drape placed in front of her, but she could feel the gentle pressure of hands working quickly and carefully. First incision, Dr. Patel announced. Maria closed her eyes, whispering silent prayers in her mind. She pictured Juan, Lucia, and Sophia waiting for her. She imagined the faces of the babies she was about to meet, the little lives she had carried for so long. The first cry broke through the room like a beacon of light. Maria's eyes flew open, and she turned her head slightly, straining to hear. A nurse's voice rang out clearly. Baby 1 is out. A girl, breathing on her own. Tears streamed down Maria's face as the faint sound of her daughter's cries filled the room. She couldn't see her, but the knowledge that she was here, that she was alive, gave her strength. Baby 2, another voice announced moments later. It's a boy. The cries came faster now, each one breaking the silence like a new heartbeat. The team of doctors and nurses worked with synchronized precision, moving seamlessly from one baby to the next. As each child was born, they were carefully placed in an incubator and whisked away to the neonatal intensive care unit, where other nurses monitored their breathing, temperature, and vital signs. Baby 3, another boy. Baby 4, she's stable. Baby 5, he's small but strong. Maria's body trembled as the hours stretched on. She couldn't feel much beyond the pressure and the exhaustion pressing down on her, but she held onto the sound of each cry like a lifeline. She lost count after the first dozen, the world around her blurring into a whirlwind of voices and movement. Baby 16, a nurse announced. Baby 17, baby 18. Maria's heart pounded. She could feel her body weakening, the sheer effort of delivering so many lives pushing her to the brink. But she refused to let go. She whispered the names of her daughters, Lucia and Sophia, over and over again, a reminder of why she had to keep fighting. Baby 19. The room fell quiet for a moment as the team prepared for the final delivery. Maria's breathing was ragged, her chest rising and falling as she fought to stay conscious. Dr. Patel's voice broke through the silence, calm but urgent. One more, Maria, he said gently. Just one more. Maria nodded weakly, tears streaming down her face. She felt the final pull of pressure, the weight lifting from her body at last. "Baby 20 is out," a nurse cried. "It's a girl." A collective sigh of relief swept through the room, followed by a soft cheer from the medical team. Maria let out a shaky breath, her body sinking into the bed as tears of exhaustion and relief poured down her cheeks. "You did it, Maria," Dr. Patel said softly, his voice full of admiration. "They're all here. 20 beautiful babies." In the hours that followed, the hospital was abuzz with activity. Doctors and nurses moved quickly between the operating room and the neonatal unit, where the babies, tiny and fragile, were being carefully monitored. Some of them needed breathing assistance, their little lungs struggling to adjust to life outside the womb. Others lay swaddled in blankets, their faces peaceful as they slept. Maria was moved to a recovery room, where she drifted in and out of sleep. Her body felt like it had been through a war, every muscle aching, every ounce of her energy depleted. But through the haze of exhaustion, she felt something else too. Relief. She was alive. And so were they. One burst into the room hours later, his face streaked with tears. He rushed to her bedside, collapsing into the chair beside her and taking her hand in his. "They're beautiful, Maria," he choked out. "All of them. They're perfect." Maria managed a weak smile, her eyes fluttering open. "Did you see them?" One nodded, brushing a tear from his cheek. "Yes. The nurses let me peek into the NICU. They're so small, but they're strong. Just like their mother." Maria let out a soft, shaky laugh, though it ended in a sob. "We did it, one. We really did it." He kissed her forehead gently, his voice thick with emotion. "You did it, Carino. You're a miracle." As the sun began to rise over the hospital, Maria lay in her bed, staring out the window with tears of gratitude streaming down her face. She had brought 20 tiny lives into the world, against all odds, through pain and fear and exhaustion. She whispered their names to herself, names she and Juan had spent sleepless nights choosing. Each name was a promise, a hope for the future they would build together. The world would call her story a miracle, a phenomenon, something out of a dream. But to Maria, it was something simpler. It was love. And as she drifted back to sleep, the faces of her children, tiny and perfect, filled her mind, giving her the strength she would need for the days ahead. The quiet hum of the hospital room was interrupted by the soft creak of the door as one slipped inside. Maria lay propped up in bed, her face pale but peaceful as sunlight filtered through the thin curtains. It had been 2 days since the delivery, and while her body was weak, her heart felt fuller than it ever had. One carried a small notebook in his hand, along with a stack of photos that the nurses had given him. He approached her bed with a smile, though the dark circles under his eyes betrayed his exhaustion. "How are you feeling, Carino?" he asked softly. "Tired," Maria admitted, her voice weak but steady. "But I'm okay." One sat down in the chair beside her, his eyes brimming with love and admiration. "You're more than okay. You're incredible." Maria managed a small smile, though tears pricked at the corners of her eyes. "Have you seen them? All of them?" One nodded, his voice trembling with emotion. "Yes. The nurses let me spend some time in the NICU. I brought pictures." He handed her the photos carefully, one by one. Each image showed a tiny baby swaddled in blankets, their delicate faces barely visible beneath the wires and monitors. Some of them wore tiny oxygen masks, while others slept peacefully in the warmth of their incubators. Despite their fragility, Maria couldn't help but see the strength in them. "They're so small," she whispered, her fingers tracing the edges of one photo. "How can something so tiny make me feel so much?" One smiled faintly, his own voice choked with emotion. "Because they're ours." Maria clutched the photos to her chest, closing her eyes as tears slipped down her cheeks. She had spent months carrying these lives inside her, feeling their movements, their kicks, their tiny stretches. And now, they were here, 20 little miracles, each one more precious than the last. "Lucia and Sophia keep asking when they can meet their brothers and sisters," one said softly, breaking the silence. "I told them it might take a while. The nurses say some of the babies are doing well, but a few of them, they need more time." Maria's heart clenched at his words. She had known, even before the delivery, that not all of her babies would arrive unscathed. Carrying so many at once had always been a risk, and now, as she lay in the hospital bed recovering, the weight of that reality settled over her like a blanket of stone. "Do the doctors think they'll be okay?" she asked, her voice trembling. Juan hesitated, his gaze dropping to his lap. "They're doing everything they can, Maria. Some of them are strong. But others, they're struggling." Maria swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the photos. "I need to see them," she whispered. "All of them?" Juan nodded quickly. "I'll talk to the nurses. They'll make it happen." Later that day, with the help of the nurses, Maria was carefully wheeled into the neonatal intensive care unit. The sterile smell of the room hit her immediately, along with the soft hum of machines and the rhythmic beeping of monitors. It was a world she had never imagined, a place where tiny lives were measured in ounces and every breath was a victory. The nurse guiding her stopped beside the first incubator. "Here's baby one," she said gently. "She's doing very well. Breathing on her own." Maria peered inside, her heart swelling as she saw the tiny girl wrapped in a yellow blanket. Her face was impossibly small, her eyelids fluttering as she slept, but there was a peacefulness about her that brought tears to Maria's eyes. "She's perfect," Maria whispered. They moved on to the next incubator, then the next. Each baby was a miracle in their own way, some sleeping peacefully, others wriggling beneath the weight of their wires and tubes. Maria reached out to place her hand gently against the glass of each incubator, whispering soft words of love to her children as she visited them one by one. When they reached baby 8, the nurse's voice softened. "This little one is having a harder time. His lungs are very underdeveloped, but he's a fighter." Maria's chest tightened as she looked down at her son. He was impossibly small, his chest rising and falling with uneven breaths beneath the tiny oxygen mask. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she whispered, "You're strong, my love. You're going to be okay." The nurse rested a hand on Maria's shoulder. "The doctors are doing everything they can for him. He's not giving up, and neither are we." Maria nodded, brushing the tears from her face. "Thank you." They continued on, visiting each baby until Maria had seen all 20 of her children. The emotions overwhelmed her, love, fear, gratitude, and hope, all tangled together in a way she couldn't describe. As the nurse wheeled her back to her room, Maria looked up at the ceiling, whispering a silent prayer. "Please let them be okay." In the days that followed, news of Maria's story spread far and wide. Headlines across the world screamed about the miracle mother of 20, with photos of her babies accompanying the stories. Reporters camped outside the hospital, eager to catch a glimpse of the woman whose pregnancy had defied all expectations. One did his best to shield Maria from the chaos. He spoke to the hospital staff, ensuring that the family's privacy was respected as much as possible. But despite his efforts, Maria couldn't escape the overwhelming attention. Letters and gifts began arriving at the hospital, tiny clothes, handmade blankets, and messages of support from strangers who had been touched by her story. One afternoon, Dr. Patel visited Maria in her room, a stack of medical charts tucked under his arm. "Maria," he said gently, "I have some updates on the babies." Maria's heart leapt into her throat. "Are they okay?" Dr. Patel smiled faintly. "Some of them are doing very well. A few are strong enough that we're hopeful they'll be discharged soon. But there are others who still need more time. Baby 8 in particular is very fragile. He's fighting hard, but it's touch and go." Maria closed her eyes, tears brimming once again. "What can I do?" she whispered. "Just keep being their mother," Dr. Patel replied. "Your strength has already brought them this far." Weeks turned into months. Maria remained in the hospital while her babies continued to grow and fight. Each day brought new challenges, but also new triumphs. Baby 8, the smallest of them all, began to show signs of improvement, his breathing growing steadier with each passing day. The nurses began to call him the Little Warrior, a nickname that brought a smile to Maria's face every time she heard it. One by one, the babies were strong enough to leave the NICU. One brought Lucia and Sophia to the hospital to meet their new siblings, and the sight of her daughters cradling the tiny newborns brought Maria to tears. "They're so small," Lucia whispered, her eyes wide with wonder. "But they're strong," Maria replied softly. "Just like you." When the final baby 20, was discharged, Maria felt an overwhelming sense of relief wash over her. It had been the fight of her life, but they had made it. All 20 of her children were alive, and though the road ahead would be difficult, Maria knew they would face it together. The day Maria finally returned home was one the village would never forget. Neighbors lined the streets, cheering and waving as Juan pulled up to the farmhouse with a van filled with car seats. Maria stepped out, holding one of the babies in her arms, while nurses and volunteers carried the others inside. The house had been transformed by the community. Extra cribs had been donated and set up in every available space. Piles of diapers, clothes, and blankets filled the corners of the rooms. The village had come together to support Maria and her family, offering everything from food to childcare to emotional support. As Maria sat in her living room that evening, surrounded by her children, Lucia and Sofia playing on the floor, the newborns sleeping soundly in their cribs, she felt a peace she hadn't known in months. One sat beside her, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. "Look at them," he whispered. "All 20 of them." Maria smiled, her heart swelling with love. "They're our miracle." The house was quiet for a moment, something that didn't happen often these days. Maria sat on the edge of her bed, cradling baby 8, her smallest warrior, in her arms. The baby's tiny chest rose and fell steadily, his breathing soft and even as he slept. Just weeks earlier, she had been terrified that he wouldn't make it, but now, against all odds, he was here, alive, thriving, and strong. Maria leaned down, pressing a gentle kiss to his forehead, feeling the warmth of his skin beneath her lips. She whispered softly, "You are my little fighter. You are so loved." She glanced toward the crib beside her, where baby 12 lay nestled beneath a blanket, his tiny fists curled up near his face. Around her, the soft hum of white noise machines filled the room, a trick the nurses had taught her to help the babies sleep. It worked like magic, offering a small reprieve from the chaos that defined their days. Down the hallway, faint giggles and whispers drifted through the air. Lucia and Sofia were playing with 2 of their younger siblings, helping to rock their cribs gently while one sorted through another delivery of donated diapers in the kitchen. The community had rallied behind them in a way Maria had never imagined, offering everything from supplies to helping hands. Volunteers visited almost daily to lend support, while neighbors delivered meals, clothes, and words of encouragement. Yet, even with all the help, there were days when Maria felt overwhelmed. She had once imagined motherhood as a quiet life, watching her children play in the golden fields outside their farmhouse, reading stories to them by candlelight, and tucking them into bed at night with kisses and whispered prayers. Now, her days were filled with feedings, diaper changes, and the constant hum of babies crying, 20 little voices, all needing her at once. But she didn't resent it. Not for a moment. The world had not forgotten Maria's story. News of her miraculous delivery had spread like wildfire, and now reporters and photographers hovered near the edge of their quiet village, eager for glimpses of the miracle mother. Magazine covers featured headlines like "A Mother of Record-Breaking Love" and "20 Lives, One Unbreakable Woman." Some of the attention was flattering, but Maria quickly realized that it also came with judgment. 20 babies? That's unnatural, strangers commented online. How will they afford to raise them? Others asked cruelly. Is this even real? Maria avoided the news as much as she could, but one couldn't help but check the stories. He was fiercely protective of their family, bristling at every unkind word written by people who knew nothing of their lives. "Let them talk," Maria told him one evening as they sat together on the porch, watching the sun sink behind the fields. She held baby 4 in her arms, rocking the little girl gently as she slept. "They don't matter. Only we matter. Us and them." Juan nodded slowly, his gaze softening as he looked at her. "You're right. But it still makes me angry. They don't see how hard you work. They don't see how much love fills this house." Maria smiled faintly. "They don't need to." She looked toward the windows of the farmhouse, where the golden light of lanterns glowed softly against the glass. Inside, the babies slept, each one a miracle that had defied the odds. They were the only proof she needed that love was stronger than anything else in the world. The days turned into weeks and then months. Life in the Lopez household settled into a rhythm, hectic, loud, and unpredictable, but a rhythm nonetheless. The older babies grew stronger with each passing day, their once fragile bodies filling out with chubby cheeks and tiny rolls. Baby 8, their little warrior, had become something of a legend among the nurses who visited. "He's a fighter," one nurse said proudly, tickling his tiny feet as Maria watched. "I knew from the start that he wasn't going to give up." Maria smiled, tears welling in her eyes. "Neither was I." The farmhouse had changed dramatically since Maria returned home. The living room had been transformed into a nursery, with rows of cribs neatly arranged like little beds in a dollhouse. The kitchen, once a quiet space where Maria baked bread and brewed tea, was now a place of constant activity. Volunteers often helped one prepare bottles, organize supplies, and sterilize endless stacks of pacifiers and baby toys. Despite the chaos, there were moments of peace, moments that made it all worth it. One afternoon, as Maria sat in the middle of the nursery surrounded by her babies, Lucia and Sophia climbed into her lap, giggling as they tried to count the cribs. 1, 2, 3. "I lost count," Sophia said with a pout. Maria laughed, hugging both girls tightly. "It's okay, mi amor. I lose count too." Lucia tilted her head, her brow furrowed in thought. "Mama, do you love all the babies the same?" Maria looked at her eldest daughter, her heart swelling with emotion. "I love every single one of you with all of my heart," she replied softly. "There's enough love here for everyone." Lucia smiled, satisfied with the answer, and nestled closer to her mother. Sophia followed, resting her head on Maria's shoulder. For a moment, the room was quiet, save for the soft breathing of the babies and the warmth of her daughter's embrace. In that moment, Maria felt whole. One day, months after the babies had been born, Maria received a letter in the mail. It was addressed to the Miracle Mother, written in delicate handwriting that looked almost too perfect to be real. She opened it carefully, her hands trembling as she read the words inside. "Dear Maria, your story has inspired me in ways I can't describe. I lost hope after a long battle with infertility, but hearing about your strength and your love for your children has given me courage. You reminded me that miracles do happen, even when we least expect them. Thank you for sharing your story with the world." Of a grateful stranger. Maria's vision blurred as tears filled her eyes. She hadn't asked to become a symbol of hope for others, but knowing that her story had touched someone else's life filled her with a sense of purpose she hadn't known she needed. She handed the letter to Juan, who read it quietly before looking at her with a soft smile. "You've touched more people than you realize, Maria." She nodded, her voice trembling. "If our story can help someone else believe in miracles, then it's worth it." As the years passed, the Lopez household remained a place of love, laughter, and organized chaos. The babies grew into toddlers, then into children with their own personalities and quirks. Their little farmhouse, once too quiet, now echoed with the sound of running feet, playful screams, and endless giggles. Maria and Juan worked tirelessly to provide for their children, but they were never alone. The village had adopted their family as their own, rallying around them with love and support. Neighbors helped with school supplies, community members offered tutoring, and volunteers continued to stop by with food and gifts. On the twins' 5th birthday, the entire village gathered at the Lopez farm to celebrate. Tables were set up under the warm afternoon sun, decorated with handmade streamers and balloons. Children ran through the fields, playing tag and chasing butterflies, while parents laughed and shared stories. Maria stood near the edge of the celebration, watching her children with tears in her eyes. Lucia and Sophia were now teenagers, helping their younger siblings open gifts and pass out slices of cake. Baby 8, their little warrior, now stood proudly on 2 strong legs, his laughter ringing out like music as he played with his brothers and sisters. One wrapped an arm around Maria's shoulders, pulling her close. "Look at them," he whispered. 20 little miracles. And they're all ours." Maria smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. "We did it, one. We made it." He kissed the top of her head, his voice soft. "You made it, Maria. You gave them life. You gave us everything." As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the fields, Maria gathered all of her children around her. They sat in a circle, their faces glowing with happiness as they listened to her speak. "You are my miracles," she told them, her voice steady but full of emotion. "Each and every one of you. Never forget that you are loved, that you are strong, and that you are here for a reason." The children nodded, their eyes wide as they took in her words. Lucia wrapped her arms around her mother, followed by Sophia, and one by one, the rest of the children joined in. It was a chaotic, lopsided hug, but to Maria, it was perfect. In that moment, surrounded by the family she had fought so hard for, Maria knew that she had been given the greatest gift of all. And in her heart, she believed that miracles weren't just something that happened, they were something you created, one small moment at a time.